Session number 102, titled Emmaus Road. We're looking at Luke 24, verses 13 through 35. So I have a couple questions for you. This was later in the day on Resurrection Sunday, probably late afternoon. But why do we find Jesus outside Jerusalem heading away from the city? How did Jesus deal with the state of mind of two discouraged followers? I started to say disciples, but in Mark we've been using disciples to mean the 11. These are not two of the 11, but they are two followers of Jesus. At least those who want to be followers of Jesus and not sure what's happened since he was crucified. What did those two do after their encounter with Jesus? Well, the scene changes from the women, the 11, and Jerusalem. All that we were talking about for the last several sessions, forget it. Well, no, don't forget it. But we're going away from Jerusalem now. And in this sequence, we meet two very discouraged disciples, not among the 11, who were not among the 11. Let me repeat that. They're on the road to Emmaus, which is not far, I think about 7 miles north of Jerusalem, if I remember properly. So, we're going to look at Luke 24, verses 13 through 16 to begin with. Now, that very day, that would be Resurrection Day, two of them, followers of Jesus, were on their way to a village called Emmaus, E-M-M-A-U-S, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking to each other about all of the things that had happened. So they've been in Jerusalem. They have known pretty much what's going on, and we're going to see a little bit more of what they actually knew. While they were talking and debating these things, Jesus himself approached and began to accompany them. So there's this character coming up. You're arguing back and forth about something, or at least discussing it. And this guy comes along, starts walking with you. But their eyes were kept from recognizing him. Sounds like Mary Magdalene, doesn't it? At first, they did not recognize it was Jesus. I do not know if they had personally encountered Jesus some other spot, but apparently, there's a good chance they had been at one of his events. So they may have seen him, may not, but they don't recognize him right now. In his third or fourth, and we don't know when Jesus appeared to Peter, so we don't know whether this is Jesus' third appearance after the two sets of women that he appeared to, or whether this is the fourth if he's appeared to Jesus prior to this time of the afternoon. Not critical. We just simply always like to wrap things up with a bow, and that's difficult to do on this Sunday of Resurrection. Again, as in the case of Mary Magdalene, we do not know exactly the mechanism preventing their recognizing Jesus, nor why they were prevented. The language seems to imply that they had seen Jesus before. They were, after all, his followers. There seems to be no indication that their vision was clouded by tears or anything else, as could have been the case with Mary. Evidently, God intervened to ensure they did not recognize Jesus at that moment. They will later. Jesus began to walk along with the two, initiating a conversation as any traveler might. Remember, in those days, a lot of foot traffic between places. He began with a simple question that stopped them in their tracks. He said, and this is verse 17 of Luke 24. Then he said to them, "What are these matters you're discussing so intently as you walk along?" As if there nothing else was getting between them as they discussed this thing. They were fixed on this discussion. And they stood still, the two, looking sad. Their emotional state must have shown on their faces. Verse 18, then one of them named Cleopas, or Cleopas, depending on how you want to pronounce it, which remember came up in the heritage of Levi, or James the Lesser. When one of them named Cleopas answered him, and this Cleopas could have been husband of one of the Marys. We don't know fully. Are you the only visitor? This is what they're asking Jesus. Are you the only visitor to Jerusalem who doesn't know the things that have happened there in these days? Evidently, Jesus' crucifixion was a widely known fact by Resurrection Day. There were those around the cross when he was being crucified. This is 2 days later, and evidently word has even spread from that group. Verses 19 and 20 of Luke 24. He said to them, this is Jesus said to the two, "What things?" And they answered, "The things concerning Jesus the Nazarene," they replied. "A man who was with his powerful deeds and words proved to be a prophet before God and before all the people. And how our chief priests and rulers handed him over," that'd be to the Romans, "to be condemned to death and crucified him." So they're talking as though they blame the chief priests for Christ's crucifixion. Their summary was extremely brief. If you took a time when I read it, it took only about 15 seconds, if this is a word-by-word account. And what did it describe? The central player by name, the nature of that player, the actions of the religious leaders, his being handed over to the Romans, and the end result of the leaders' actions. So 5 major events and actions and doings that they got over in 15 seconds. These two rightly blamed the religious leaders, the religious elite, for Jesus being handed over to the Romans. So they would have blamed them for his crucifixion. Notice that Cleopas implies that the religious leaders were the real crucifiers. That's what I had read earlier. Their summary supports Jesus' person and ministry being widely known in Jerusalem. So these were not isolated events to them. Here they acknowledge that Jesus was a prophet. They expressed their hope that he was the prophet and the Messiah. In Luke 24:21. But here's where they're going to let that information out. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. That would be the Messiah, of course. Now, not only this, but it is now the third day since these things happened. Furthermore, some women of our group, now catch this is where we had read earlier, some women of our group amazed us. They were at the tomb early this morning when they did not find his body. They came back and said they had seen a vision of angels who said he, Jesus, was alive. Then some of those who were with us went to the tomb, that sounds like Peter and John, and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him. So this sounds like Mary Magdalene had bolted from the group, if she went with the group, went to Peter and John. Peter and John went to the tomb. In the meantime, the other women returned and reported, apparently, of having seen the angels and the empty tomb. Remember, Mary Magdalene had not seen the angels, so they had gotten two women's reports that these two had been privy to. And the one group had said that Jesus was alive, but then nobody had seen his body. They haven't seen him. So nobody had seen Jesus by the time that these guys left. One wonders if there's any significance to the reference to the third day. They may have been simply stating the facts of the case, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. Or they may have recalled something that Jesus had said about rising on the third day. But they did say the women talked about the angels telling them that Jesus was alive. But even the 11 hadn't realized the import of that claim that Jesus had made. Remember, they never did fully understand what he meant about rising from the dead. The pair had evidently been with the other disciples in Jerusalem when the women, that's plural, reported back, when the group of women had reported back seeing the empty tomb, hearing the angels tell them Jesus was alive. Some of those were evidently, I'm having trouble with that word today too, right? Some of those, as mentioned here, were evidently Peter and John, or at least included them, one would suspect, because we're only told that Peter and John did go and do the checking about the empty tomb. While the two men had verified the empty tomb, the men had not yet seen the living Jesus. So evidently, Jesus' appearance to the 11 is waiting until this session with these guys is over. Well, let me ask you the question. Does their reference to Peter and John's not seeing Jesus imply that the women were still not believed at the time they left for Emmaus? Probably so, because it doesn't say that Peter has even seen Jesus. There are two choices depending upon when the women made one or two reports. Evidently, they knew of the women's first report, but likely before the women had seen Jesus, and we think subsequently making a second report. The two didn't say that the women reported having seen Jesus. They said the men hadn't seen him, but the sound of it could have meant also that the women hadn't seen him, which would mean Mary Magdalene hadn't got back and reported her visit with Jesus either. Perhaps the women reported twice, once before Jesus' appearance to them, and then one more time after he appeared to them. That would mean that the two left Emmaus after the women's first report, and as for Peter and John had returned from the tomb, but before the women's second report and before Mary's report, the second report. Of course, they may have heard the women's report of having seen Jesus, but rejected it, but did not speak of it. That seems less likely. It seems that they were rejecting the fact that anyone had seen Jesus. That would leave open the question of whether the group women made one or two reports. I think they made two. But again, that's what I think. Their hope that Jesus was Israel's Messiah had seemed to be shattered by his death. Their hope was fragile and appeared to include Jesus' immediate restoration of the kingdom, something that the disciples, even after his resurrection, thought was going to happen. Their hope was not yet in the form of trust. Like the 11, these two probably did not believe the women's witness, except that Peter and John said, yeah, they're true about the empty tomb, but the angels, evidently Peter and John never saw the angels either. Remember, Mary Magdalene apparently had not seen the angels until after Peter and John left the tomb, which was her second visit to the tomb. Jesus never leaves his disciples in the dark of despair. He took over the conversation and produced a scriptural lesson. And Jesus typically would do that. He'd take people to what the scriptures actually say. And I'm going to look in verses 25 and 26 of Luke 24. So Jesus said to them, "You foolish people, how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Wasn't it necessary for the Christ to suffer these things and enter into his glory?" Sounds like he may have gotten into Isaiah. You should have known the truth of all of these things, that the Messiah had to die. He went on to elaborate. Luke 24:27. Then beginning with Moses, who would speak of the prophet like him to come. Beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things written about himself in all of the scriptures. And of course, if there's anybody who should know that, it would be Jesus. Jesus used and therefore affirmed the Old Testament scriptures in order to prove his point about the Messiah, apparently something never revealing his identity. They don't know who he is, but yet he went all the way through the prophecies about him, revealing everything they had to say. Can you make a case from the Old Testament for Jesus being the Messiah? That's what Jesus just did for these men. Can you duplicate what Jesus gave them as proof that Jesus was the Messiah? Something to think about, folks. He seems to finish just as they approach Emmaus. What a scripture lesson that must have been. They walked about 7 miles while he was doing this with them. So it took a while. So they approached the village. This is in verses 28 and 29. They approached the village where they were going. The two men were going. He acted as though he wanted to go on farther. Remind you of the time he was walking on the water, when he appeared to be going right on past the boat where the 12 were stationed. But they urged him, the two urged him, stay with us, because it's getting toward evening and the day is almost done, showing mid-east hospitality. So he went in to stay with them, at least for a bit. Just as Jesus had done when walking the Sea of Galilee, he gave the impression that he was going to continue on beyond the disciples. He wasn't going to impose on them. He wouldn't just say, okay, you've had your discussion, I'll keep going. But getting toward evening likely implied it was probably about 6 p.m. And at least 6 p.m. wasn't far away, because remember, that's when evening ends, at 6 p.m. in Jewish time. But their Middle East tradition of courtesy didn't permit him to go on uninvited. Luke 24:30. When he had taken his place at the table with them, he took the bread, blessed it, and broke it, and gave it to them. But Jesus performed the role in this case, and the results literally opened the eyes of the two men. It'd be very unusual for the guest to break the bread. It would be the host who would break the bread, as Jesus did on his Last Supper. Look at verse 31 of Luke 24. At this point, their eyes were opened, and they recognized him. Then, and if this were Mark, he said immediately Jesus vanished out of their sight. But they got to know him before he left. Jesus' resurrection body seems to have allowed him to come and go in a moment, and to be recognized or not as he chose. With their eyes open supernaturally, they could not see him anymore, but their hearts knew. In Luke 24:32, they said to each other, "Didn't our hearts burn within us while he was speaking with us on the road, while he was explaining the scriptures to us?" Our hearts were on fire because he was explaining things for us. A burning heart when learning of God is the primary sign of a worshiping heart. Worship in spirit through a knowledge of truth. If you would have been one of the two men on that road, what would that have caused you to do? Have you ever thought about it? If I was there listening to them, what would I have done the minute Jesus left? Well, they did too. Verses 33, 34, and 35. So they got up that very hour, meaning really that moment, and returned to Jerusalem. So they walked 7 miles back. They found the 11 and those with them together and said, "The Lord has really risen and has appeared to Simon." So while the Emmaus Road stuff was going on, Peter had already been visited by Jesus. Peter hadn't gotten back and reported that, apparently, by the time these guys left, but apparently that happened. So between the time Jesus appeared to the women and the time he appeared to the two on the road to Emmaus, sometime in there he must have visited Simon. Then they told, the two from Emmaus, told what had happened on the road and how they recognized him when he broke bread. It was likely approaching night when they arrived at the house in Jerusalem, but the trip back was worthwhile. They learned Jesus had been seen by Peter. He has been risen. They know that now. And they are able to relate their story, which was believed. It seems that Peter's account of having seen Jesus was believed by everyone who heard it. There's no indication people scoffed at him as they did the women. Peter, along with the two from Emmaus, made 3 male witnesses verifying that Jesus had risen just as the women had earlier claimed. Apparently, however, Thomas wasn't there at any time that afternoon and evening. He apparently still does not believe that Jesus is risen. So there's doubting Thomas hanging out on the wash there. Note that as of this point, Jesus had appeared to at least 6 people. 3 women, at least 3 women, probably 5 or 6 women, but at least 3 women and at least 3 men. Mary Magdalene, the other women who went with her to the tomb, Peter, and the 2 from Emmaus. And there will be another appearance yet that evening, and we'll look at that in our next session. So, these are quicker sessions. They're going by. This one's a little bit longer, but it's in preparation for the big meeting in the upper room that he resurrected.